6 News presents the 8th Congressional District Debate. Here's tonight's moderator, Sherry Jones.
Good evening and welcome to the first debate between the candidates from Michigan's 8th Congressional District. Tonight's debate will feature incumbent Democrat Alyssa Slotkin and challenger Republican Paul Young. Now, for your reference, Michigan's 8th district stretches from Ingham County east, including Livingston and the northern half of Oakland County. It's made up of urban, suburban, and agriculture areas. For years, it was a Republican stronghold. In 2018, Alyssa Slotkin won the seat, beating Republican Mike Bishop, and brought the district across the aisle. Now the first-term Congresswoman is facing a challenger, Republican Paul Young, successfully navigating through the August primary to earn his place on the November ballot. Well, tonight is the time for you to listen as they square off in their first live debate. Representative Slotkin has spent her career in national service. She was recruited by the CIA to be a Middle East analyst. Now, she worked alongside the U.S. military during 3 tours in Iraq as a militia expert. In between her tours, she held various defense and intelligence positions under President Bush and President Obama, including roles at the White House. A third-generation Michigander, Representative Slotkin spent her early life on her family farm in Holly, Michigan, which she now calls home. Paul Young worked in his family business that maintained housing for military families, created more than 500 jobs, and supported working families. And additionally, Paul was a deputy district attorney who worked in the domestic violence unit to protect battered women and abused children. Most recently, he worked in the Trump administration at the U.S. Citizens and Immigration Services to stop illegal immigration and to secure our borders. So thank you both for joining us tonight.
Good to be here.
And I'd really like this to be a conversation between us, so feel free to respond to any of the questions that I'm about to ask each one of you. So let's get started. We're going to begin tonight with Congresswoman Slotkin. Well, how do you see, or what do you feel is the proper role of government in American life?
Sure. I mean, there's no bigger conversation that typically characterizes differences between Democrats and Republicans. I believe that our government's role is to make available the opportunity for every person, no matter who they are or where they're from, to make it in our country in a way that lets them live out the American dream. And in most cases, that means setting some basic standards, helping our states and our local communities succeed, and where necessary, putting in place policies that protect things that we all value, like our Great Lakes and our natural resources. I also think the federal government has a responsibility to live up to the moment and make sure that we are always constantly trying to aspire to be better and live up to our founders' definitions where all people are created equal. We've certainly seen in the past couple of months that idea pushed and tested again. And then lastly, I think there's a role to convene people, to make sure that as elected officials from the federal government, we have a responsibility to bring together people who might not otherwise be in the room together, to unite rather than divide, because our kids are watching. So that's where I feel the role of the federal government is.
And Paul?
Well, I think it all, for me, starts with kind of our founding documents, the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. We talk about, and we want to live up to the idea of this: we are all created equal, that we have the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And we have a Constitution that's established that gives us a framework for how our government should help to guarantee those rights and freedoms for people so they can live their lives as they choose to live them in all kinds of different ways. So they can choose to worship how they want to live. They can pursue the type of living that they want to pursue. They can live their lives as they want to live them, and they can live them free from fear of both repression by their own government, but from dangers that could come from other people as well. And of course, another role of government is to help people where they need that help. And we've seen that clearly in this pandemic. We couldn't let anyone by themselves get through a global pandemic like this. So it's an excellent example of a role government plays to help rally people together, to find solutions to problems, and to help people that need extra help as we protect ourselves and then build ourselves back up. So that's part of the role of government that I would see.
Well, our next question was inspired by Bill Nelson from Okemos, who says we live in a very polarized time. So my next question for each of you has to do with partisanship. So Representative Slotkin, your campaign ads feature the fact that you've worked with presidents from both sides of the aisle. We talked about that at the top of this debate. Now, Paul Young's campaign ad said that you vote with Nancy Pelosi right around 96% of the time. So if that is true, then how partisan or bipartisan are you?
Sure. So, I think for me, bipartisanship really runs in my blood because in national security, it's really a focus on the mission and not which party you're from. When I served 3 tours in Iraq, no one ever asked me, are you a Democrat or Republican before you get into a Humvee? And I know that Mr. Young has spent a lot of time, a lot of money playing these ads that talking about this percentage, 96%. So let me just address it right up front. First and foremost, that is a misleading and cherry-picked piece of information. It represents just about over 70 votes that I've taken, when in fact I've taken over 800 votes, and 640 of those votes have had at least another Republican joining with me. They've been bipartisan. I'm someone who's a member of the Bipartisan Problem Solvers Caucus. It's equal numbers of Democrats and Republicans who meet every week and work on common legislation. And then I've taken on my leadership when I need to. I've voted 56 times with Republicans and against my own party. That's approximately once a voting week. So for me, I don't come into this as a political person. I come into it as someone who is in national security and believes the mission is helping people. And I hope that that same independence is something that Mr. Young could demonstrate. I think that's an important thing, to pick the 3 or 4 things where he can demonstrably prove that he has different views from President Trump or from Senator McConnell. I'm willing to put that on the table and not talk about just statistics and cherry-picked intelligence, but actual policy.
Well, then let's turn the tables a little bit and talk to you about that, Mr. Young. So you're talking about 96% of the time voting with Nancy Pelosi. So if President Trump is reelected again, will you vote with the president 100% of the time? And if not, then what areas do you have serious policy disagreement with him on?
I think I can almost certainly say I wouldn't vote with the president 100% of the time. I can think of one specific example. I know that President Trump had suggested cuts in the Great Lakes restoration. I would oppose that. There will be undoubtedly many different things that the president would pursue that I would focus on what the interests of the voters of the 8th District is. But it's interesting in listening to Congresswoman Slotkin talk about cherry picking votes when of course that's of the 800 votes, she can only pick out 56 where she says she voted with Republicans. And in particular, it's interesting to me that her definition of a bipartisan bill is one where at least one Republican voted with her. So there might be an excellent example of whether that's really bipartisan or not, is the $3 trillion HEROES Act that the House passed back in May. That was opposed by 14 Democrats and only had one Republican who supported it. So I suppose by Congresswoman Slotkin's definition, that is a bipartisan bill. But of the 14 Democrats who voted against it, most of them said this was terrible Washington politics, that it was delaying the resolution or bringing relief to people with coronavirus. And as we can see, since that bill never became law and we still don't have a follow-up bill, her fellow Democrats who identified that bill as deeply partisan with no chance of becoming law and of delaying any chance of bringing relief to people, that proved to be true. And it really, if that's an example of the bipartisanship that you'd be getting from Congresswoman Slotkin, I think the 8th District deserves better.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm happy to talk about the HEROES Act. I didn't love that bill. I didn't love every part of it, but I voted for it because of how deeply Michigan was walloped, because it included a ton of money for our small businesses, a ton of money for our schools, for broadband internet, money for our cities and towns, the kinds of things I've been working with my Republican mayors on since the very beginning of the crisis. None of the Democrats who voted against that bill were from the states that got walloped and hit the hardest. So if you would vote against money for our small businesses, if you would vote against help for our schools, that's your choice. But I think it's really important, if we're going to talk about the differences between us, to pick up the issue that is the most important one in the district from what I can tell, just by walking around and going to the grocery store. And that's the difference on protecting people with pre-existing conditions. And not as an issue of a talking point, not something that you've polled, Paul, and that you know may be popular to talk about. I'm talking about like putting your money where your mouth is and voting to protect people with pre-existing conditions. I got into this race because my mom, who struggled with health care because she had a pre-existing condition, did not have health care when she was diagnosed with stage 4 ovarian cancer. This is a very real thing to many of us. So please tell us. We have a vote, and we have a case going to the Supreme Court on November 10th to repeal those protections with pre-existing conditions. Mr. Trump has pursued this and doubled down since COVID. Please tell us where you stand on protecting people with pre-existing conditions. It's a real thing for many of us.
I'm happy to address that specifically. I absolutely believe we have to protect people with pre-existing conditions. That's a position I've had ever since I decided to get into this race. So unfortunately, I think the way you frame the issue is another example of kind of partisanship and a failure to, instead of focusing on solutions, just look to take political shots at people. As a member of Congress, I won't have a role in what a Biden or a Trump administration chooses to do with lawsuits or issues before the Supreme Court. What's more important as a member of Congress is to say, should that court case go against us, what are we going to do instead? And I know that there's legislation in the House of Representatives that is prepared to address and guarantee people with pre-existing conditions continue to get insurance coverage, and I would be supporting that kind of bill. I wouldn't be framing the issue around, would you please attack some other politician or the president or whatever it might be. I'll be working on solutions for people in the 8th District, and I'm again happy to make very clear I will support and protect people with pre-existing conditions.
I think it's important because, Paul, if you do have this seat, you will be asked to vote. I've voted over 5 times to protect people with pre-existing conditions. These things do come up in the House. We voted specifically on whether to pursue challenging this very specific court case to the Supreme Court. So tell us, it's not about partisanship. It's about whether you're going to stand up for people in this district who literally, their lives are at stake here. Do you support that the administration's court case, or do you not? We had to vote on it. These are the kind of tough calls you have to make when you're an elected official.
Look, I'm perfectly prepared to make tough calls. I don't think there really is a need. Congress doesn't decide or take a vote on whether the administration files a lawsuit or not. So that's really kind of a false choice that the Congresswoman is offering. What I'm saying is that if that court case succeeds, we would have to have new legislation to protect people with pre-existing conditions, and I would absolutely be supporting that. Again, this seems to be a false choice about how to get to the goals that we have, and we could bring up more examples of where if you work together to get solutions that could solve a problem, instead of taking a harsh partisan position, we could get solutions, whether it's on lowering the cost of prescription drugs, whether it's on finding a new solution or new protections for coronavirus. There are so many examples that we could go through. This partisan effort to say, how do you feel about a lawsuit that the administration is pursuing, that's really kind of a sideshow.
So let's make it more specific. Your predecessor, who I beat, he took a very specific vote in the House of Representatives to repeal and replace Obamacare. And indeed, he sat on the White House lawn and he celebrated the fact that he had repealed protections for pre-existing conditions. The only reason that we didn't repeal and replace those protections is because John McCain walked across the Senate floor and voted against your party. So please tell us, would you have voted for repeal and replace, or would you have voted with John McCain against your own party? It's a very specific and real thing that affects so many people.
Yeah, no, and I appreciate the question, and I can only repeat what I've been saying repeatedly today and have been saying throughout the campaign. I will protect people with pre-existing conditions. I'm not wanting really to go back and litigate issues about Obamacare and the Affordable Care Act. Those seem to me to be partisan arguments of the past. When it comes to protecting people with pre-existing conditions, lowering the cost of prescription drugs, any number of different health issues, my focus will be on the people of the 8th District and what works for them. Will I be interested in repealing Obamacare or improving Obamacare? Only as it affects the people of the 8th District. So going back and fighting these partisan battles is really not of interest to me. It's interesting, though, that you should mention Senator McCain. That example where he voted against his party on a big bill is exactly the kind of things we would like to see from you if you're going to say that, look, I regularly, or at least often enough to say that I'm independent, where's that big vote? Where are those 2 or 3 big votes that you've taken
Sure.
against your party?
I'm happy to go through them. I will go through.
Actually, what we're going to do,
Go ahead.
we have, and I appreciate the lively discussion. We have many topics that we're going to get to, and healthcare is one of them coming up. But right now, another big issue that we're talking about is, of course, mail-in voting. So we did a recent poll here at WLNS TV6 that said 52% of Michiganders plan to vote absentee, most of them likely by mail. So do you believe that that's a safe and secure way to vote? And will you promise to abide by this election and the results of it? Congresswoman Slotkin.
Sure. Yes, absentee voting is a legitimate form of voting. I have great belief in our local clerks, and in the 8th District, those clerks are Democrats and Republicans, in administering our elections in accordance with the law. I do find it really concerning, the number of people who have talked about absentee voting as unsafe, but I want to be clear that I consider it, and as it is, a legitimate form of governing. And of course, we are going to see the results of the election here in a little more than 45 days. As long as they are administered freely and fairly as I expect, then of course I will accept the results of the election. I am concerned as a national security professional, the number of times I've heard the president question the results of the election, the number of times since April that he's laid out that he doesn't support absentee voting. It's really concerning to me as someone who believes in democracy more than anything else. Absentee voting is legitimate, and I hope people never have to choose between their health and their vote.
Mr. Young?
In a spirit of cooperation, I was going to say I agreed with everything that the Congresswoman said, and I did. I believe in absentee ballots. I have confidence in the clerks across this district, and I fully expect that whether I win or lose, I can accept the results of that of the election that we're about to see. But I think again, the Congresswoman apparently can't help herself. She then pivots right to a partisan attack against President Trump, ignoring the fact that there have been many Democrats who are saying we must resist at all costs. We have doubts about elections, urging Mr. Biden not to concede at any point. I mean, you see just a partisan attack. But I would like to add one thing about absentee ballots. There have been attacks on the Postal Service. The Postal Service does a good job. It's not a perfect institution, but people should have confidence that if they mail in their ballots, and I should add, I would encourage people, if you're going to mail in your ballots, do it early. Don't wait until just a day or two before the election. If you still have your ballot and you want to send it in, take it to your polling place. But this whole hysteria that's brought up that somehow the Postal Service can't deliver mail, I think that's a disservice to people. But I will emphasize again, I'm confident that the clerks in the 8th District can run a good election, and it'll be good.
All right, very good. So staying with you, Mr. Young, at this moment, of course, Congress is debating the COVID relief bill, and elements of this bill include, as you know, more stimulus money, an extension of unemployment pay, and money to support state budgets, which are definitely hurting because of the COVID-19 crisis. So do you support these policies? And if so, how much money would you like to see in stimulus payments and support for unemployment?
Yes, I do support these. The CARES Act and the previous 2 acts before that, I was supportive of those acts. And that's why I was saying earlier that the HEROES Act, which was just so many unrelated aspects, $1,200 stimulus checks to illegal immigrants, letting violent criminals go free, putting a ban on voter ID, so many things that were just so unrelated to COVID relief were part of what made that such a terrible deal. And as Congresswoman Slotkin's colleagues who are Democrats indicated, that passage of that bill would just delay getting more coronavirus relief, and that of course is what we've seen. It's not easy for me to put an exact dollar amount on what we need, but what I would say is that we should be focused on, as it relates to relief for state and local governments, on problems that they have faced because of the coronavirus. We don't want to be bailing out states and local governments who have financial difficulties for other reasons. I would continue the unemployment benefits. I would continue the stimulus. But it's unfortunate that partisan politics has led to this delay, and I can promise the people of the 8th District that if you send me to Washington, I will focus on your interests, not just the interests of my party.
Congresswoman Slotkin.
Yeah, so that's a perfect segue to what I was doing last week, where after negotiations broke down on this additional COVID bill back in early to mid-August, a group of us, the Problem Solvers Caucus, this group that's 25 Democrats, 25 Republicans, we were deeply unsatisfied that leadership in the House, in the Senate, and in the White House were refusing to get back to the negotiating room. We started meeting quietly without staff over Zoom every couple of days to hash out what we thought was the best way forward on a plan. So the plan combines assistance for state and locals. It has money for unemployment. It includes additional stimulus checks, which is something that the president has said that he has also wanted. It includes money for our schools so that they can teach no matter where the kids are, in person or virtual. And it's a bridging bill that takes us through about February so that we can reassess. We can look then at where we are with the coronavirus. Are we in sight of a vaccine? Are we coming out of this recession? Or do we need to approve more? It's about $1.4 trillion. It is a good compromise way forward. And I was sad that my own leadership in the House of Representatives, along with the Senate, were resistant to using that as a framework. But it is my job to answer to the concerns of people in my district, the Zoom calls I have all day long with folks who are just desperate for help. This was what we put forward, and I hope that leadership from all sides takes it up.
Staying with you, Congresswoman, do you think that there should be a national mask mandate to help stop the spread of COVID-19?
I don't support a national mandate. I think that there are communities in this country where they've been blessed, they haven't been hit by COVID, and there's been places where we've been walloped, like here in Michigan. And I think that we should go with our best medical advice. We know that masks help. We know that when people are masked, they're likely to not receive the virus or spread the virus. So certainly in a place like Michigan, where we were really hit, I encourage people to wear them and to follow the guidelines, but I just don't believe in a national mandate.
All right, Mr. Young, your thoughts?
I agree. I would oppose a national mandate. I've really been encouraged when I look at. It's hard to imagine 7 months ago the incredible things that Americans have done to rally to confront the coronavirus. I mean, this whole idea of social distancing, of wearing masks. Probably many people who are pretty good hand washers are even more aggressive about washing their hands. So many people have jumped in and voluntarily done things to help reduce the spread of coronavirus. People have, without too much complaint really, stayed at home, although we definitely see people who are starting to say, wait a minute, we need to find ways to safely re-engage in life, because obviously there are great costs to staying forever locked down. But I'll agree with Congresswoman Slotkin. I would be opposed to a national mandate for a mask.
All right, so moving on, we're going to take a look at another issue that's definitely dominated the conversation for the last several months, and that is policing and race. So I'd like you both to take a look at this diagram that we have here. I'll give you a minute to consider it. Just look at the different circles. Where do you fall in this diagram, and why do you think the debate about this situation has gotten so volatile? And what, as a member of Congress, can you do about it? And Congressman Slotkin, we're going to begin with you.
Sure. So I think this is a pretty good graphic of how probably most people feel. Listen, I don't think anyone could watch the video of George Floyd's murder and not be disgusted. And then as a congresswoman, watching people in our district in the Lansing area, but throughout even the rural and suburban communities in our district, people standing up and saying they're done with racial injustice, with institutional racism, and really making their voices heard. It was really, in many ways, inspiring. At the same time, we cannot, and I do not, condone violence. As someone who is in national security my entire career, all I did was try to prevent attacks on the homeland. So if someone's using violence on any side, they should be treated accordingly. If they're committing a felony or destroying property, they should be treated accordingly. And I don't support things like defunding the police. Many of the things we're talking about training our police on requires, in some cases, more resources. But I do think my responsibility as an elected official is to convene people, again, who would not otherwise be in the same room together. And this is something that when I started doing these giant meetings, these Zoom calls with my African American leaders in the district, they said, please help us come together, help us unite with people and explain what's happening. even to those people who might not agree with us. And I was hearing the same thing from a lot of the white residents in the district. So one of the things we were able to do was bring together African American business owners who had talked about their struggles of getting a first loan with the Michigan Banking Association. We got them all in a room together, and we were able to have a pretty hard conversation, but a very real conversation about how we get better and how we move on. So I believe that's my responsibility and the responsibility of any elected leader in 2020.
Mr. Young, your response?
You know, Sherry, thinking back to the graphic that you had up there, the 3 different circles. The first was those outraged by the death of George Floyd. You know, I think I remember close in time to his death in late May and then into early June, I saw a survey somewhere that said like 94 or 95% of Americans were disgusted by what they saw, outraged by that death. So I think pretty clearly almost all Americans looked at that and said, that's just not acceptable. Then supports good police officers. Again, I think that's widely felt throughout this country. I can say, as a former prosecuting attorney who worked with sheriff deputies, state police, city police, I absolutely respect the work they do every day. They deserve our political support, and all too often across this country, they're not getting it. We're having too many local leaders, whether it's mayors in Minneapolis or Portland or other cities across this country, who are just kind of turning their back on police, making their difficult job even more difficult. And then finally, that third circle there, which I'm hoping will come back up on the graphic so that I can be reminded of just what it was, does not condone looting and rioting. Thank you, appreciate that. One would hope that would be universally understood, but that's another reason to be concerned with Democratic leadership. The Democratic Party had a 4-day national convention. This was after 2 or 3 months where there, of course, had been peaceful protests, but there had also been many rioting and looting incidents where innocent life had been taken, and we heard not one word. And it's shameful, I think, that one of our 2 leading parties seemed to be just turning a blind eye or just uninterested in what was happening to people around this country and to the breakdown of public safety and keeping people safe and secure in their neighborhoods. So I squarely put myself in that middle category there, and it's a shame that the Democratic Party wasn't doing better.
I think it's important to be factual. And I think it's inappropriate and unfair to say that the Democratic Party has not condemned looting and violence. I just did it, as did Vice President Biden and just about every other leader that I know. Nope. What I have seen is people fomenting this idea that to divide people and to create fear gives one political party advantage. And when groups, white supremacist groups, have come out and used violent slogans, when they've threatened violence on the streets, when they've brought Nazi symbology into our own communities here in Lansing, where were you speaking out about those groups? If we're going to be honest about what's going on, we need to have an even hand here. Violence is not okay for anyone, though that hate language is not okay for anyone. It doesn't matter what side you're on, and you had the opportunity to speak out. Why don't you speak clearly about groups like the Proud Boys and hate groups in our own community?
I'm unclear what opportunities you think I've missed. I've always been against hate groups. I've always been against racism. I've always been against Nazism. That's never changed, and at any opportunity that it's come up in a public event, I'm happy to take that position privately, publicly, everywhere. But to the Congresswoman's comment that Democratic leaders are always standing up against rioting and looting, that's simply false. Speaker Pelosi was asked by a reporter about a mob that was tearing down statues in the town she grew up in Baltimore. And they said, Speaker, if that's going to happen, shouldn't that come after a public hearing and after some elected body makes that choice? And Speaker Pelosi said, people will do what people will do. That is a failure to stand up for law and order and for keeping people safe. And it's just unacceptable. We need better leadership. And unfortunately, Congresswoman Slotkin, by being in the Congress, keeps Speaker Pelosi in a leadership position. So it's one reason why we should not re-elect Congresswoman Slotkin, and because we absolutely should not have Nancy Pelosi as Speaker.
It really seems like Mr. Young wants to be running against Nancy Pelosi, but you are running against Alyssa Slotkin. You are running against me. I'm standing right here, and I'm telling you my views, separate from Speaker Pelosi, separate from anybody. I don't take my orders from anyone. So let's talk about here in this district.
Well, of course, your point, though, was that Democratic leaders were uniformly...
Not uniformly, many leaders, including Vice President Biden at the National Convention.
Then it's good to make it clear that Speaker Pelosi Pelosi was not among them. And I think the viewers of this and all the voters should know, when you elect a member of Congress, you are either going to get, as a Democrat, almost certainly a Democratic speaker, or as a Republican speaker. If you vote for Alyssa Slotkin, you will almost certainly be getting Nancy Pelosi as Speaker. And with that type of sentiment, I think that's a danger for this country.
Well, if you want to talk about dangers to this country as a national security professional, having someone at the top, out of the White House, putting out messages of hate and division. Do you, Paul Young, support President Trump in those messages? Do you support this idea that both sides are okay when one is using, Nazi symbology and saying, Jews don't represent us? Do those things to you, do you agree with those things?
Of course not. Of course not. I thought I just said it earlier, and I'm happy to say it again. Anyone who's expressing racism, who's expressing anti-Semitism, who's expressing support for fascism or Nazism, I oppose it. I will speak out against it.
I hope you do that in the future. When you were asked about the Proud Boys, you literally just turned and started attacking me instead of having the opportunity to condemn them, and they're a fast-growing group in our district.
Thank you. Moving on. I'm going to ask you again to take a look at the screen. Now, this size of the deficit this year is $3.3 trillion. The size of the federal debt is $20 trillion, and that's actually tripled since 2008. Now, this is something that both parties have had a hand in. As a member of Congress, you vote to approve the budget each year. So how concerned are you about the size of the deficit and the debt, and what will you do about it? Where does it end? How much is too much? This is something that, as you can see from that graphic, is just growing exponentially. Mr. Young, we'll begin with you.
It is a troubling concern. I mean, I think I can remember when President Bush left office, candidate Obama talked about how the debt had grown, and then I think under the Obama administration, it doubled, and it has certainly gone up under the Trump administration. And it's being tested right now as well, because we are spending trillions of dollars for relief in coronavirus. And let me be clear, I think that's appropriate. In an emergency situation like a global pandemic, the federal government should be a backstop. It should be getting resources out to help people in a difficult time. But we will have to find ways to limit the growth of it, because there is at some point where it just gets too much, where when interest rates will rise again, if our debt continues to grow, we will drown out our ability to have any programs if we don't keep that in check. So it will require looking at growing the economy so that we can increase tax revenue. It will require that we look for spending cuts where we can find them. And I know for Congress that's always a difficult thing to do, but it will have to be a priority because we just can't continue forever and ever to see debt and deficits.
Yeah, I agree. I actually think the national debt is currently higher than even your chart reflected because of all of our spending on Corona. And while we all understand spending money in the middle of a global pandemic, we were accruing huge amounts of debt before the pandemic even happened. In times of plenty, we were accruing major debt. And just a couple of weeks ago, our former governor, Governor Snyder, a Republican, came out and said that the 2017 tax bill was a major reason why we had accrued up to $2 trillion in debt. That's the size of one of our Corona bills. But in order to cut that deficit, it's true, we need to do some serious belt tightening. And I think it's important to talk about specifics and not generalities. The specifics here, the first thing I would do, the thing we could do tomorrow, is allow Medicare to negotiate for drug prices. That would save $50 billion a year. And it's just makes common sense. Everyone who shops at Costco understands this. If you're going to buy in bulk, you should get a cheaper price on those drugs. But because the drug companies have such a stranglehold over all of Washington, we have not been able to get this very basic Medicare negotiation across the finish line. We passed it through the House, but not through the Senate. That's the first place I'd start to try and trim the debt.
Any response to that? Or?
I didn't come tonight with a list of specifics on cutting spending. I mean, obviously that will have to be, I don't know just how high of a priority. I mean, I think the priorities for Congress when the new Congress comes in is going to have to be continuing to fight the coronavirus pandemic, looking for ways to get the economy growing again, because it is a growing economy that will help us to solve so many problems, including the debt. So I don't have a list of priorities on spending cuts right now, but obviously it's something that we'll have to take a close look at.
All right, very good. Well, President Trump has talked about eliminating the income tax and payroll tax, actually, the payroll tax, which would allow people to keep more money in their pockets because of the situations that we're going through, these really tough economic times. But of course, the Social Security Administration says if that were to happen, then the trust fund would be out of money by mid-2023. So, do you support the president's plan? And if so, what specific plans do you have to keep Social Security going? And I will begin with you, Congresswoman.
Sure. Well, Social Security and Medicare are things that people have worked their entire lives to earn, and we should not do anything that threatens those benefits. And unfortunately, any decision to suspend or certainly to cancel altogether the payroll tax, that would directly affect the money in the coffers of Social Security. So I don't support it. The president did come out with this plan. It was a little unclear whether he meant canceling it altogether for this year or just postponing it. I know the Chamber of Commerce, the National Chamber of Commerce, was also confused and said, Mr. President, we can't implement this by the September deadline because we just don't exactly know what you mean. And we need to be really, really clear when it comes to covering Social Security and Medicare into the future. I think that there's lots of things we can think about when it comes to making sure it's solvent, both Social Security and Medicare. I'm a big believer, frankly, in a buy-in to Medicare and for anyone at any age so that we get young people supporting it early in their lives as a way to diversify the amount of health care that they have available to them. But what I do know is that we shouldn't change the number, the amount of checks, the age in which you get Social Security and Medicare. Those are things we've earned our entire lives.
You know, I was asked earlier tonight, would there be instances where I would disagree with President Trump? And to the extent that the characterization of the looking at the payroll tax is that the president has suggested abolishing it, that would be a place I would disagree with the president. As Congresswoman Slotkin said, this is an earned benefit. This is something that Americans have they've been paying into the system, they've earned it, they deserve it, they rely on it. We absolutely have to preserve and strengthen both Social Security and Medicare. And one of the central ways we do that is through the payroll tax. So whether suspending it briefly in a difficult economic time or not, you know, we could be open to that because we could talk about could the general revenue fill into that hole. But as a permanent solution, unless I saw a program that was going to provide that revenue, it seems like a non-starter to me. That's been a very basic part of Social Security, and quite frankly, any proposal that would look to abolish it, I think people would rightly say they would fear that is that a threat to our Social Security benefits, and I would be opposed to it.
All right, well, we talked about this issue off the top of our debate today. It's an issue that affects almost every single American at some point in their lives, and that is health care. So, Congresswoman Slotkin, are you good with Obamacare as it exists right now? Does it need to be improved, or would you support a single-payer system?
Yeah, so, I believe that everyone has right to health care that they can afford. And how we do that is literally our generation's challenge to solve. I think the underlying principles of Obamacare or the ACA are extremely important. And I talked about how personal it was to me, this very basic idea of protecting people who happen to be born with a pre-existing condition. I believe most people think that that's a reasonable theme. Is Obamacare perfect? No. Is there a long way to go? Yes. Was it a good start? Yes. I just don't believe in throwing the baby out with the bathwater, saying we repeal and replace and having no idea what comes next, no real plan in place before we throw out those protections for people with pre-existing conditions. I support a buy-in to Medicare for anyone at any age. I do not support something like Medicare for All just because I've never been able to have someone explain to me how we afford it, how we pay for it. But I believe that if we had a buy-in, a public option as it's called, then you would see young people flocking to it for their first job. You know, they don't want the gold-plated health care. You'd see employers thrilled that they wouldn't have to pay for all their employees' health care. It would create competition, and there's nothing more American than competition to bring prices down. So that's where I stand, but I think it's important to be very clear on this about what we're proposing, because if you're Sarah Stark in Holly, Michigan, if you're Jim Jones in Oxford, you depend on these protections for people with pre-existing conditions. They're not something theoretical, they're real, and you can't just talk about getting rid of them without having a specific plan already in place before you start monkeying with their health care.
Well, I'm happy to emphasize yet again that I will absolutely protect people with pre-existing conditions. You don't have to have the Affordable Care Act to have those protections. That said, as I've already said before, I don't come with a pre-existing agenda that I want to abolish the Affordable Care Act. There are things that we should focus on. For just as one example, there are, I think it's about 180 million people who have health insurance that's provided through their employer. And most of those people are reasonably happy with the health insurance that they have. Where there can be modest improvements, we should absolutely work to make those improvements. When people talk about concerns about health care and health insurance, which aren't exactly the same thing, you can have health insurance and not be getting very good health care. But they're often, what they're talking about is concern about prescription drug prices or surprise medical billing. And there are proposals out there to work on both of those issues, proposals that I support. And it again brings us to an example of work that's going on in Washington, that if we had a more bipartisan approach as opposed to the partisan approach that we get with Congresswoman Slotkin, we might solve those problems. Back in December, there was a drug cost bill that was introduced, and it was on an almost party line basis, voted for, including by Congresswoman Slotkin, but that bill, of course, went nowhere. There was a bipartisan bill that had, I think, 40 different provisions in it that were bipartisan provisions that would help reduce the costs of drugs, that was rejected directly by Congresswoman Slotkin. That's why it's part of the reason, and there are just so many examples where instead of looking for bipartisan solutions and making compromises to get to a bill which had sponsors in the Senate and might conceivably have been supported by the White House, instead stays with a very Democratic-only bill that won't go anywhere. So we must address people's real and legitimate concerns about health care, and in one area that gets expressed in trying to lower the cost of drugs, we have another missed opportunity, and I think we can do better.
So it's just a little bit hard to understand this idea of you trying to put this partisan lens on things when literally of the two of us up here, I have passed bipartisan legislation on drug transparency. It was purposely built. I build my bills purposely so that there are equal numbers of Democrats and Republicans. I try at all costs because in divided government, the only way to get things done is to make it bipartisan. It passed the House and it's been sitting on the desk in the Senate for almost a year. And it's important to me to be clear, we can't just say in general we support things. In general, we know these talking points work. We need to hear solutions. So for me, on drug pricing, people should be able to know when they leave their doctor's office how much that prescription is. They shouldn't have to wait till they go up to the pharmacist counter and realize, holy moly, it's 10 times what I thought it was going to be. And the pharmacists across the district tell me people every single week just put those drugs back on the counter and walk out. So we've passed a bill through the House that would allow people to know when they leave what the price is. To me, specifics matter, not theoretical stuff, but specifics. And this attempt to put in a partisan lens on it just doesn't square with the actual record.
Paul, I know that you've repeatedly said that you will protect people's work-provided health care. So what about people that don't work, or how do you expect them to get their health care?
Well, I think there are a number of things that we can do. I mean, there is, of course, Medicaid, and Medicaid provides health insurance and health coverage for many people. For people that are seniors, we have Medicare. And we will, and as I said, I don't start looking at the Affordable Care Act with an idea of it should be abolished or we need to stick with it. So, I mean, the Affordable Care Act could be a place that provides an opportunity for people to in those marketplaces to go and get health insurance. I mean, we have the ability to provide subsidies to people so that they can afford, when they can't afford health insurance, so that they can buy it. So it's not just that, and you know, it's kind of a historical artifact that so much of our health insurance is tied into employment, but that's the way it is now. It would be Herculean probably to change it, but we can do things like have subsidies for people so that they can buy health insurance.
All right, thank you both. Our next question is about the health of our planet. So we've gone from people to our planet, and this was inspired by our news viewer, Elaine Fishoff. So do you believe that the climate is changing and that change is taking part largely because of human actions? If so, what will you do as a member of Congress to stop it? And if not, what evidence do you base your beliefs on? Mr. Young, we will begin with you.
Yeah, I do think the climate is changing, and I'm not a scientist, so I can't give an exact measurement of what part of that is man-made and what part comes from other just kind of natural changes in our climate. I think the important question is, what do we do as a result? And I think we need to look for ways to be as fuel efficient as we can and to have as clean of fuels as we can. But we also have to look at the trade-offs. I can see the graphic there with wind and some of those types of sources. There are trade-offs when you have those kind of energy sources. When you dam a river, or when you have wind power, it's not as consistent, it's not as reliable, and it has environmental impacts as well. So I think we need to have an approach that looks to all different types of energy and doesn't exclude certain types of things. I mean, part of the reason that America has seen, as compared to many other countries, the greatest growth is because we are now changing away from coal and into natural gas, and that's largely because of fracking. There are so many reasons that it's good that we've gained energy independence, but one of them is that we are seeing a mix of fuels that allows us to reduce our carbon footprint and have less of a man-made impact on the environment.
So yes, I believe that the climate is changing, and I'm not a scientist, but I respect science, and I believe a good portion of that is certainly man-made, and it's clear that a dependence on fossil fuels is the greatest contributor to that climate change that's out there. I also think we have a special responsibility here in Michigan as the steward of the Great Lakes to do everything we can to preserve our local environment. And frankly, I come at the issue of the environment from a national security background. And I think we need to start thinking about environmental security as homeland security, because it's literally about the safety of our kids and the preservation of our way of life. If you can't give your child a glass of water without knowing if they're going to get a learning disability for the rest of their life, that's a threat to your family. And if you can't fish the Huron River where you learned to fish and your dad learned to fish, that's a threat to your way of life. So that's the approach that I take. In terms of dealing with climate change, I think we need to really think big about transitioning off of fossil fuels. Michigan is actually better off than most states and have some important transition plans already aimed at 2040. But it is clear that we need what I basically call the Green Manhattan Project, the greatest minds of a generation in a room with a budget, with a plan to help us transition off of fossil fuels in a way that's responsible, that preserves jobs and transitions those jobs, but that helps mitigate the pretty devastating effects of climate change.
So what do you think about the Green New Deal?
That's a question to me?
Sure.
I think it would be a disaster. You want to create a parody about it, but when you talk about you would ban air flight or darn near ban it, the list of things that the Green New Deal would force upon people would just change our life, and I think in a way that most Americans just would reject. And so we need to look for solutions. We need to unleash American ingenuity to find solutions to these problems, and to have. And it's interesting when you think about the Green New Deal. I think someone associated with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez said, "Look, it's really less about preserving the environment, and it's more about just regulating the economy." So whatever the motivation, we need less central control from Washington and more letting people, letting Americans, of course, letting industry find solutions to these problems, and not just getting a direction of a Green New Deal, which would cost jobs, which would drive up prices, which would fundamentally change our way of life. It's just not acceptable.
Congresswoman Slotkin?
Yeah, well, I'm a pragmatist, and the Green New Deal just was so huge and so unwieldy that it actually made it less likely that we'd pass environmental legislation rather than more likely. And I'm about actually getting results. So to me, one of the most bipartisan issues I work on here in the district in the state is preserving our Great Lakes and focusing on what we need to do here at home in Michigan. I don't support the Green New Deal because I think it's unwieldy and it makes it less likely we're going to be able to do things like preserve our Great Lakes. Again, I think there's lots of really interesting ideas out there, and a Green Manhattan Project is where I put my energy, just really smart minds, figuring out what we need to do, bringing people along in the process, rather than an idea that is probably motivated by perfectly good intentions, but makes it less likely it's actually going to pass.
All right, thank you both for that. Now, just a question more about your integrity, the things that you bring to the White House. What is your greatest personal attribute that you think that you will be bringing to Congress? And what about your weakest? Could you start, Congresswoman?
Sure. I mean, listen, over the past 2 years in this district, I've had to take some pretty tough votes. I've had to take votes that people say would end my very short congressional career. And I took those votes knowing that they would be controversial because I felt like there has to be something more to this job than just like putting your finger out there, figuring out which way the wind blows, and voting that way. To me, the oath of office is something I've taken many, many times before this job, and I have to be able to look myself in the mirror, regardless of what my party wants or what anyone in particular tells me I should do, and I think I've proven that in the past 2 years. So hopefully that ability to speak truth to power and to rely on my integrity is something that I bring from my past life and is a strength. As a weakness, I mean, for me, I think when you come from a national security background, you have certain expectations for the way things run, for the way a culture is supposed to be in a place like Congress. And one of the hardest things for me was showing up in Congress and adjusting to the culture of that body. I'm used to a place that's very mission-driven, very chain of command, where if people decide on a plan, that's what they do, and it's all for the betterment of the country, the protection of the country. And in Congress, that's not always what people are there for. And I will admit that I've had a hard time adjusting to the culture of Congress because some people are there for themselves, they're there for the glory of it, and they're not there for the mission, and that can sometimes be hard.
All right, Mr. Young, same question for you.
I guess the attribute I would start with is that I'm a good listener. I used to be a television reporter. I was a prosecutor, and so I had to listen to crime victims, police officers, and as a political candidate, a first-time political candidate, I've had many instances where I was talking with a group of people or in a room, and people would come back to me and go, "Wait, you hardly said a word. I didn't even know you were running for office." They said, shouldn't a politician be wanting to tell me everything and explaining the way the world is to me? So my approach to things is as a listener. I think I am a good listener, and that will be an important quality, I think, as your member of Congress, because I don't know everything. I mean, I think I've got a good background, having worked in my family business, helping to create jobs, having been a prosecutor in a domestic violence unit, to protect battered women and abused children. I've worked, as I said, as a television reporter. I was an investigative counsel with the Senate Judiciary Committee, another role that I had to listen. So I think that quality of listening is one I would bring to the role of being your representative. If I had to say something that maybe is not as something you would brag on, I guess, it would be sometimes I can have too much enthusiasm, and I can be ready to jump right in and want to make a change, so I'll probably have to temper that a little bit with that real listening to make sure, hey, let's make sure we know and don't just charge right in and be offering suggestions and solutions until we've got a consensus, until we really understand the whole problem.
All right, thank you both very much for that. Now, as we begin our wrap-up, we're going to do a quick thing we call the rapid fire round. And because we're here...
Is this the fun part?
This is the fun part,
okay,
yes. Right. And this is because we're here at 6 News. Right. We are looking for some answers from you. Take your time with these to each of the following 6 questions, okay? So, Congresswoman Slotkin, I'm going to begin with you. Should we wait until after Election Day so the winner of the presidential election can then nominate our next Supreme Court Justice?
Yeah, I should say we should be able to just take a beat and recognize what Ruth Bader Ginsburg did for our country. As a woman, as a country, she had profound, probably more profound impact on our daily lives than most people in history. And so it's sad that we have to move right along from that. But I agree, frankly, with where Republican Senator Susan Collins came out today or in the past couple of days, which is we're already in, the election has started. I mean, there's early voting going on in many states across the country. Fair is fair. Let's just have the next elected president nominate the next Supreme Court justice. It's a lifetime appointment. So let's have a fair fight in November and let the next person elected decide who our next Supreme Court justice is.
I'll join that salute to the late Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. I mean, I think America is a great country, but it's never been a perfect country, and she was a leader who helped get over some of the stereotyped roles we had for men and women and make it a place that women in our society could fulfill and do all the things they might want to do without legally imposed limits, and she was a leader in that, and she will be missed. Having said that, the Constitution gives the president the right to nominate justices to the Supreme Court, and I've read recently that in 29 instances in the last year of a presidential term, a Supreme Court position became open, and in all 29, the president has nominated someone. So I think the president has every right to do so, and I expect that he will.
All right, very good. Next question, yes or no? We'll start with you, Paul.
Okay.
Should marijuana be legalized at the federal level?
Boy, yes or no? The states are all doing it. I think eventually we will get there, yes.
Congresswoman Slotkin.
Obviously in Michigan, we've legalized it. I do support decriminalizing at the federal level, mostly because at this point, you know, our own marijuana industry in a place like Michigan can't use federally backed banks because it's still a crime at the federal level. We want our marijuana our marijuana industry to be safe and responsible. Whenever there's an unbanked community, as a CIA analyst, I will tell you that's always a place that's rife for opportunities for criminality. We want them to be legal, so yes, I support decriminalizing.
Right. And staying with you, should there be term limits for members of Congress, yes or no?
I would support term limits. I think the Goldilocks approach, I think in some cases, maybe in the state of Michigan, they're a little too short, 3 terms. As soon as you learn the job, 6 years, you're out. But I also don't think we need to have people in for 30 years.
Paul?
It would be quite a constitutional undertaking to have term limits. I can say that I'm quite confident I wouldn't, should I be elected, I won't be there for 30 years. Open to the idea, but not sure it would be an easy thing to do.
All right, real quick, yes or no, real quick. Spartans or Wolverines?
Spartans.
Wolverines.
All right,
Ann Arbor.
Michigander
You're running to
or
represent Michigan
Michiganian?
State, man.
Michigander or Michiganian?
Michigander.
Michigander.
Oh, very good. Soda or pop?
Pop.
Oh, very good. All right. Consensus.
Come on.
All right. Well, thank you both. And that does conclude our very first debate. And we want to thank you to our candidates, Congresswoman Alyssa Slotkin. Thank you for your time today. And of course, Paul Young, thank you so much for being with us. And we would also like to thank our viewers for tuning in tonight and joining us in this last hour of very lively debate. We've covered dozens of issues, so we thank you very much for your time with that. And we want to encourage everyone, go out and vote.
Go and vote.
Yep, go vote.
Very,
thanks
very
to you.
important. Thank you very much. And now we invite you to go to WLNS.com for a post-debate breakdown featuring our very own political correspondent, Tim Skubic. I'll see you there in just a few minutes, and thank you both again.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.
Nicely done.